Jesus Christ.
A man, a name, a story. No one knows what he looked like, how he lived, and who he really was. It was not until years later that the story of the Jewish wandering preacher and scholar was written down. Nevertheless, he remains in cultural memory and became the central figure of a world religion. But did he really exist? Jesus himself did not write any texts. The accounts about him are always from second or third hand. However, there are historical documents that report about him, based on oral traditions, as was common at the time. The Roman Jewish historian Flavius Josephus reports on Jesus and the events of his time in the 1st century. He mentions the condemnation and crucifixion of Jesus by Pontius Pilate. Tacitus, a Roman historian and politician, reports in his Annales about Christus, the namesake of the Christianos, who were hated by the Romans. There are other Jewish sources from the 3rd century. The Babylonian Talmud is one of them. Here, in the tractate Sanhedrin, it is reported about Jeshu, who was killed on the eve of the Passover festival. Besides the ancient sources, the Gospels in the New Testament of the Bible also report about the life of Jesus. They were written between 70 and 120 AD. If they didn't write during Jesus' lifetime, then of course oral tradition was the only thing people had back then. That was nothing out of the ordinary, at least not back then. Today, we would think it completely unreliable, but that was not the case back then. The Gospel of Mark is the oldest gospel. The other authors relied on it, which is why essential passages agree. In addition, the Gospels used other sources, including one with sayings of Jesus that was probably already written around the year 50. Perhaps the Passion narrative is also older than the Gospel of Mark. We have 4 major Gospels, and these Gospels were all written by people who wanted to inform others about the faith in Jesus and who, of course, wanted to engage in mission. Therefore, today, we are of the opinion, and this is the case in historical science, that we say only what we have from 2 independent sources counts as historically reliable. That means we need the Christian writers as well as those who were not Christians. Today, theologians deal scientifically with the New Testament and the person of Jesus using the so-called historical critical method. It aims to place the Bible in its historical context and to draw conclusions about the life and work of Jesus using other historical sciences and methods. It came to pass in those days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. The census is the reason why the pregnant Mary and Joseph make their way to Bethlehem. It is the beginning of the Christmas story in the Gospel of Luke, which reports about the birth of Jesus. But can the story from the Gospel of Luke in the Bible be historically verified? And is Bethlehem really Jesus' birthplace? At the location where the Church of the Nativity stands today, the historical critical method of theological science comes to the following conclusions. Mark, the oldest evangelist in the Bible, does not know anything about Bethlehem as a birthplace. Here the source situation is such that Nazareth is rather named as the hometown of Jesus. John also writes about Jesus from Nazareth, the son of Joseph. Bethlehem or Nazareth? That is a question that is simply not answerable historically. It is a theological question. Is Jesus the successor of the Davidites, the great King David? And if I confess him as the Messiah, then he must have been born in Bethlehem. So it is a theological question that leads us to Bethlehem and not a historical one. And that cannot be proven. However, the Gospels contain historical clues that give indications of the chronological classification of the birth and the political circumstances. Luke writes about the Roman Emperor Augustus and a census that was to take place in his empire. Augustus ruled from 27 BC to 14 AD, including in Palestine from Rome, and indeed in the province of Syria, to which Judea belonged. A census can be traced under the governor Quirinius in the year 6 AD. The historian Flavius Josephus reports about it. However, according to the evangelist Luke, it took place during the time of King Herod. King Herod is historical. He is mentioned several times by Flavius Josephus, and to this day, archaeologists find clues to his extensive building activities like the Temple of Jerusalem. However, he already died in 4 BC. Whether there was already a tax registration during his reign cannot be proven historically, and we only know the one of Quirinius in the year 6 AD. This does not match the Gospels at all. At least, Luke says it happened the year before Christ, but it was just a few years later. Also, the exact date of Jesus' birth cannot be determined. The biblical sources describe that Jesus was seen by many people as the expected Jewish Messiah. According to the traditions in the New Testament, Jesus was primarily active as an itinerant preacher in Galilee. At the beginning of the 1st century, this area was part of the Roman Empire, Jesus defended prostitutes and tax collectors. He wanted to give a voice to the disenfranchised. He was there for the sick and even for children. In this way, he wanted to establish the kingdom of God in this world. According to the evangelists, from Rome's point of view, this could also have been understood as challenging the Roman rule system and asserting claims to worldly power. After all, he belonged, according to tradition, to the David dynasty, the idealized ruling family since the times of the Old Testament. The then Roman Emperor Tiberius ruled from 14 to 37 AD. He tolerated no political resistance in the Roman Empire. Every uprising was pursued and crushed. According to tradition, Pontius Pilate put Jesus on trial. He was prefect in Judea from 26 to 36. This can be proven historically. He donated a building and had an inscription attached. At some point, the house collapsed and nobody really cared. And the large stone with his name was then used to build it into the theater of Caesarea. It became a seat. When the theater was newly excavated 30 years ago, the stone was found. In the Temple of Jerusalem, Jesus had to become more and more of a problem, because the high priest Caiaphas, mentioned in the Bible, was dependent on Rome. Historical data about Caiaphas can be found in Flavius Josephus. The ossuary found in 1990, which is said to contain the bones of the high priest, remains archaeologically disputed to this day. The residence of Pontius Pilate can be reconstructed today. It was originally the palace of Herod. Pontius Pilate lived there when he was conducting condemnations in Jerusalem. In the case of Jesus, he could not risk his office. Ultimately, he was obligated to Tiberius. Pontius Pilate and Tiberius are also mentioned by name in the Gospel of Luke. According to biblical sources, it was religious and political reasons that led to the accusation of Jesus. That Jesus was put on trial under Pontius Pilate is written about in ancient Jewish and Christian sources. It is hardly conceivable that the Romans would have recognized a religious reason, and only Pontius Pilate and only the Romans could pronounce the death sentence. That would be completely different if it had been a religious verdict. If the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Council, had decided to kill the man for religious reasons, then the method of execution would have been different. It would have been stoning, and none of that happens here. After the condemnation, it was customary in the Roman Empire to drive the condemned through the city and the crowds. The present-day Via Dolorosa commemorates the path of suffering that Jesus is said to have walked to his crucifixion site. However, the current location of the Via Dolorosa is not historical. Since the 18th century, we have been walking a route that leads over the north of Jerusalem. And the Franciscans, who established this route, did not think about it at all. They did not consider that the city of Jesus is not the old city today. The old city today has shifted to the north. That means, even today, Golgotha is in the middle of the old city. And in the middle of the old city is the present-day Via Dolorosa. Back then, it would have been outside. On Golgotha, according to the New Testament, Jesus was crucified. 4 Roman sources, including Suetonius, confirm that the Romans had the custom of announcing the reason on a tablet. Translated, Inri means Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. It is also reported how the Romans conducted crucifixions at that time. The feet were nailed. The reports say that, and we know that from other cases, through the ankle bone. It hurts terribly. And of course, that was a way to secure the person there, causing them to suffer but remain motionless. Between 30 and 34 AD, Jesus died during the Passover festival outside the gates of Jerusalem on the cross. Flavius Josephus is considered one of the key witnesses to the events during Jesus' lifetime. He writes in the so-called Testimonium Flavianum, "About this time lived Jesus, a wise man, if one should even call him a man at all. He was the Christ, and although Pilate, at the instigation of the principal men among us, condemned him to the cross, those who had loved him previously did not cease to do so. For he appeared to them alive again on the 3rd day. In the subsequent centuries, Christianity spread throughout the world. The crucifixion is a historical fact attested by ancient witnesses. What cannot be verified is what significance the crucifixion had in the history of religions. Overall, the stories of the evangelists do not match the results of the historical critical method. So far, it has not been possible to verify the exact birth or death of Jesus. He could have been born between 7 and 4 BC and died between 30 and 34. But the scientists largely agree on one thing. Jesus existed as a historical figure. The message of the Jewish itinerant preacher has become a world religion. Which historical events did you find most exciting, and why? Let us know in the comments below, and if you liked the video, subscribe.